If you're new here today, if you're visiting, we are working through. I didn't do a PowerPoint today because I have lots to get through, and so I can't be distracted. I also went to bed at around 2:30, so it's we didn't do one. But they just they distract me. But we are working on the problem of violence in the Old Testament. This is what somebody brought up. So thank you. Normally this is taught at seminary over an entire semester, and we're going to do it in 25 minutes here. But I'm glad you brought it because this is a big question, right? Violence in the Old Testament is a big question. And it's one of those questions that Christians struggle with, but certainly non-Christians struggle with a lot, right? Like, what is up with this? And so we're going to give you the answer. And the first answer is that there is no answer to this question. There's lots of answers, and you can read all sorts of different books. I read basically 4 entire books that were 4 entirely different points about how to look at this. And so there's a lot of things out there. And so if someone's like, well, I think this, or think we all think lots of things, because this is one of those questions that it's not just like, oh, here it is, it's black and white, and it's very simple. So if you're like, oh, good, this will be the black and white simple answer. There is no black and white simple answer. My big encouragement to you is to sit with the violence and sit with these texts and think about it and pray about it and talk about it. And if people in your life are like, what about this, hopefully today will help you a little bit, maybe reframe it a little bit, and at least give you some ability to kind of chat through it with people, and even for yourself, because this is something I struggled with for a long time and still struggle with, because it turns out when you read lots of books about it, you just have more questions, and you have more things, and it makes it even a bigger issue for you. And so, so lots of different books. I can encourage you to read some. There was one I read was terrible. I encourage you not to read that one. But some of them, again, and so we're going to first, to start off, we're going to kind of go through some of the major answers to this question and kind of how do we deal with this. First one, of course, you just reject it all and say none of it's, but that's not good, because then you can just reject whatever you want. So I don't encourage you to do that. Don't just reject it all. Another answer that people do is they spiritualize it. This is especially in the Orthodox Church and the early church, guys like Origen and Anselm, and again, the Orthodox Church. All of the language of violence, right? And again, when we talk about violence, we're going to focus mostly on the conquest through Joshua, which is also talked about in Exodus and talked about in Judges and talked about in Deuteronomy. But it's all that same time period. It's the conquest of Israel coming out of Egypt into the Promised Land. And the violence mostly that people struggle with, I mean, we could talk about the flood if we wanted to. That was fairly violent, if you're aware of that story. But this is the one that people really struggle with, because it's going in and it's like, just kill everything, kill everybody, women, children, animals, everything. Just. And people go, hey, that doesn't sound right. I struggle with that. And you should, by the way. If you're like, sweet, makes that, that's probably something we should talk about too. And so one way to do it is you just spiritualize it. You go, all that language is just spiritual. This is about just fighting sin in our own hearts and all of these kind of things. And so, the only hard part with that, of course, is you go, okay, I understand, and there's truth to all of these things, by the way. There is truth to all of these things, except for the reject all of it. That's not a good one. But to spiritualize it and to say, yeah, that is something we can do, and certainly the Orthodox Church does, and says, I read these passages, I don't have to understand it all, but it does allow me then to look at my own self. By the way, it's also hot in here. I don't think the air conditioning is working, so I do apologize for that. We did it on purpose to make you uncomfortable. And so, but sometimes when you spiritualize things, we can end up making our faith kind of always look like ourselves. Well, if I just spiritualize everything, it kind of just caters to me, so we can struggle with that. The other one is called divine command. Divine command is just, listen, God said it, it's good. If he kills them, he has a reason. They must have deserved it for some reason. You just don't question it, right? Kind of Augustine, kind of Piper, that's kind of where they're at. We have nothing to say. It must be moral because God said it. Which, of course, when he said wipe out all the children and animals, I'm not sure how moral degeneracy works in that sense. But the bigger question with that, the bigger problem with that take is when God calls us to act justly, if that's how he acts, if that's justice for him, how do we then follow God in that sense? And there are Christians who say, yes, we should use violence because the Old Testament. And so you just don't go on the internet. They're just like all over the place. There's a book written by 2 guys right here. Osty, who is a professor but also preaches at Cedar Creek. Him and a guy named Webb. They wrote a book called Bloody, Brutal, Barbaric. It's $70, so don't buy it, just borrow it. This is called Progressive Revelation, which is basically what they did with their last famous book too, which is you read it, but you don't just look at it, you look to where it's taking us. It's this, and so God, yes, he allows the violence, but that's not truly what he wants. He just allows it because they don't really know better. They can't deal with what will come in the New Testament, which is love your enemies, right? That's truly where God wants to get us. So he allows this, but he's taking us on a journey and eventually gets us to Jesus in the New Testament. That's where he wants us to go, and so you don't really, part of the problem with that is, what do we do with this? And so, yes, it's violent, but don't worry about that quite so much. And again, I'm paraphrasing like a huge book. But we're moving towards Jesus, and that's the really important part. But of course, there's OT. The Old Testament condemns violence. New Testament has violence. So some of these things. But also, one of the bigger problems there is God allows it because they weren't ready. It's like baby steps. Got to feed them baby food. But in other ways, God gives them really super detailed things about sacrifices and how much fat in this. So there's some really detailed things, but somehow violence was just like, you're not ready for that yet. So people do struggle with that book as well. A guy named John Walton, he's got a whole Lost World of series. It's very good. He just he says in that culture, when you write, kill everything, we destroyed everything, you really didn't. It's just how you talked. And he uses all sorts of examples. It's just how they talked in those days. Everybody, every time you won a battle, you said, you play basketball, you go, oh, we destroyed them. Did you actually destroy them? No, you beat them. You won by 3. Way to go, right? But we destroyed them, right? Same thing. He goes, that's basically the same thing. It's just the way they talk. They were just normal battles, very normal, soldiers fighting soldiers. It's just how we talk. So kind of that hyperbole, ancient writing, which again, problem with that a little bit, you can kind of just soothe over some of the pretty violent stuff, right? And you go, so for some people, these answers just don't really, whatever. Projection, Israel assumed that when they won, God allowed this. They assumed God wanted them to kill everybody, and they just kind of project onto God their own feelings. And again, there could be some truth to that, but one of the bigger problems is how much else have they projected? What else about the Old Testament, about the Bible, is just them projecting versus what has God actually said? It doesn't really help. It just kind of says, well, clearly it wasn't of God. There's the other view, which is just mystery. Don't worry about it. We don't know. We only see through a glass dimly. We don't understand. That one's not super helpful to a lot of people, right? Don't worry about it. We don't get it. It's good for you because then you walk away. Not always good for everybody else. And then the last one, this is kind of a big one too, is in Jesus, Jesus is the clearest picture of God that we have, right? He is the clearest picture of God that we have. And so if Jesus preaches love for enemies and peace, then we have to read the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus, which we do anyways. And so clearly that can't really be of God. That can't really be what God wants because that's not how we see Jesus. And so you got to go with Jesus. You got to read through the lens of kind of like the cross and the defeat of evil, just through the life and teaching of Jesus, which is how I read the Bible. I read everything through the lens of Jesus. But the problem with this, again, is we kind of just flatten anything and be like, well, let's just focus on Jesus, and again, not really talk about some of these things and deal with it, which is not always good. And so as we go through this, and again, there's a lot. There's a lot in here. But as you read these passages, especially Deuteronomy, Joshua a little bit, read it through the bigger lens of the entire Scripture. And there's one thing the Old Testament says over and over and over, as we read this morning in Psalms, is that God is full of love. The Lord is compassionate and gracious, Exodus 34. He's slow to anger. He's abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. A lot of people say, see, God punished Canaanite, they punished these cities because of their sin, moral degeneracy. But the one thing is, you read through the Old Testament and you read, especially through the Psalms and just all these different things, love God and love your neighbor. That's in the Old Testament. Jesus didn't make that up. He's just re-quoting Exodus 34. The one thing we know about God is that he is compassionate. He is full of love. And his love goes to the 1,000 generations, his punishment only to 3 or 4. And again, there's a whole thing even around the creation. There's no violence in creation, right? There's no violence in creation. When violence enters into creation, this upsets God. The whole flood story is about there was so much violence, it was ruining creation. It was ruining humanity. God has to start again. So when we read the Old Testament, we have to read through that bigger picture of who God truly is, which doesn't settle this question, doesn't make it easier all of a sudden. But the bigger picture is not some violent God, because a lot of people go, well, God's so violent in the Old Testament and so peaceful. Jesus is peaceful. What do we do with these? But actually, God is always the loving God. God is always the one. with new mercies in the Old Testament. And that continues on into Jesus, but it is there in the Old Testament. But there's also the violence. And so where does it leave us? I don't know, where does it leave you, right? And so it is a confusing thing. It's confusing. We're about to get more confused too. We are. Because as you read through Exodus and Deuteronomy and Joshua, two totally different pictures appear. You get two very different things. So Deuteronomy 7:22, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you, little by little. You will not be allowed to eliminate them all at once, or the wild animals will multiply around you. But the Lord your God will deliver them over to you. This is Deuteronomy 7:22. It's slow, right? It'll be slow. God is going to do it, right? And it's eventual, right? So that's this process. It's slow. God's going to do it. He's going to drive. And if you read through all the stories over and over, they keep saying, God will do this for you. God will drive them out before you, the Canaanites. It might take a while, but this is how it works. But then you go 2 chapters later in Deuteronomy 9, he says, God will destroy them. He will subdue them, and you will drive them out. And you will annihilate them quickly as the Lord has promised you. And so now it's fast, and Israel has a role in destroying everything. And so Deuteronomy 7, it's God, it's slow. Deuteronomy 9, it's quick, and Israel plays a part in that. And if you read all the way through, again, you can't read it all this morning, so we're not going to. These same two stories keep coming out. And it's very confusing, which is why we have multiple books and multiple ways to answer this question, because it's, unfortunately, not super clear, right? Some stories portray total destruction, right? They come into, especially to, the story of Jericho, but through Canaan, everything's destroyed. We killed everything. Every man, every woman, every child. We took out everything. But then just a few chapters later, those people are still alive, and there's these messages of destroy everything, and then right after they say that, they say, by the way, down the road, don't intermarry with them, don't make covenants with them, you're like, wait, they're still alive? I thought we killed them all. I thought you were supposed to kill them all. And so if you're confused, you should be, because it is confusing. It is confusing. But the reality is, if you read through all of this, especially Exodus, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and you get into Judges, and you read all of those stories together, the reality that comes out is that at no point did Israel actually go into Canaan and wipe everybody out. The one thing that you can definitely tell is that there are a lot of Canaanites still around. They never, ever wiped out an entire group of anybody. It was very slow, because by the end of Joshua's life, he's like, there is so much land that we have not conquered yet. And you're like, okay, so you clearly didn't do this. And so there is these two stories. One is, yes, this is how we're going to do it. The other is the reality of it, which is God will do this. It's going to take a long time. And so, yeah, even Judges 2, right? Like, this is the reality. It says, therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors, and he's not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. I will use them, being the nations, to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors. This is what Judges tells us, that in fact they didn't kick the people out. In fact, they were there, and that God was now going to use them. Right? The Lord has allowed these nations to remain. He did not drive them out by giving them into the hands of Joshua. What are you supposed to do with this? Go into the land, wipe everybody out, and in Judges, he's like, God's not going to do that anymore. In fact, he's going to use these people to test you. Not helpful. Not helpful at all. And if you read all the way through again, all the things, we're going to go into these towns, we're going to destroy all these people, and again, over and over and over, it just keeps saying, actually, those people are still alive. A couple of chapters later, 1 chapter later, 5 chapters later. And overall, if you read all these books, the biggest picture that comes out is that when we speak about violence, especially the violence of the conquest, because that's such a big part of the Old Testament, and people struggle, it's not about going in and killing people. The language around it, again, as best as I understand it, and I could always be wrong. I haven't been wrong yet, but one day I might be. And this might be it. This might be it. But this whole entire language is about going in, and it's about separating themselves. It's about separating themselves. It's about going into a place and making sure you don't become like the people there. The one thing as you read through all of this, it comes up over and over and over, is the separation of yourself. Over and over, you have to destroy their idols. You have to destroy their altars. You have to not make covenants. Don't intermarry with them. Smash every Asherah pole, that comes up all the time. And so the one thing that we can be absolutely sure of is when they go in, whatever language they use, whether it's hyperbole or they're trying to use metaphor, or whether they're actually killing people, the point behind it is their total separation. It's separation from these people. God has brought them out of Egypt. He's bringing them into a new land, and he wants them to pay attention to him. He wants them to follow him. Joshua says at the very beginning of the book, what does he say? Choose today who you will follow. That is the point of this book. That is the point. Joshua all the way to Kings. It's all one kind of big story of this entire moment. And the entire thing is what? Who will you choose? Will you follow me? And they don't, by the way. Spoiler alert. They keep messing up. Right? Again, Joshua 20 in his farewell speech, he says God will not continue to do this. He doesn't say you guys aren't going to be allowed to just murder everybody anymore and commit genocide. He says God will not drive out these nations. If what? If you don't follow the Torah. If you follow the Torah, God will continue to drive them out before you. He will continue to push them out. And so there's these two stories. But here's the thing, and one of the books I read was really helpful. He reframes this all. The story of the conquest, right, is just a continuation of coming out of Egypt. And if you don't believe me, it goes like this. They're in Egypt, then they celebrate Passover, and they cross through the Red Sea. Then they have this wilderness journey. Then they end up at Sinai, where they get the law from God. Then they have a wilderness journey. Then they have a Passover, and they cross over the Jordan. And then they end up in Canaan. And as much as whether, how the stories actually happen, the writers are writing it out in this way. And when Joshua comes, just like Moses had to take off his shoes on holy ground, so does Joshua. Just like the ladies saved Moses, Rahab saves the spies. The parting of the Red Sea, the parting of the Jordan, the 10 plagues in Egypt, in Canaan, there's the miracle of Jericho, the walls fall down, the miracle of the hailstones, the sun stands still. After liberation from Egypt, the golden calf, after they defeat Jericho, their first big, this is us as a nation following God, there's a guy who hoards all the gold and treasure, and he has to pay for that. Right? People have to circumcise before they celebrate Passover. Happens in both stories. And God hardens the heart of Pharaoh. God hardens the heart of some of these cities. This is why they were destroyed. It says because God hardened their heart. No matter what actually happened or not, the writers are trying to let you know this is part of this story. This is a continuation of the Exodus out of Egypt. Right? They're making it very, very clear for us. This is a continuation because as they come out of Egypt, what is God trying to say to them? He's trying to say, listen, you are a new people. You have a new idea. You're no longer in Egypt. You're no longer slaves. You're coming out here. And as much as you had to put off Egypt, now you need to make sure you don't put on Canaan. You have to make sure you don't put on Canaan. And so the whole story of the conquest is it's finishing the exile and becoming this people of God. Right? And again, these stories, especially Joshua, these stories aren't written until the exilic, once they're in exile. After David, after the kings, they're in exile. This is when it's being written down. Why? Because they're sitting there going, how did we end up in exile? How do we make sure we don't come here again? So they start writing down their own history. And they're writing it down, for the people who are now going back post-exile, back to Israel, back to a tiny piece of land with no army. They're not really a great nation anymore. And the people who are writing this down, they say, read this book, take it with you, and remember how we got here into exile, and make sure you don't do that. How did we get into exile? We followed other gods. We forgot God's word. We didn't follow the Torah. And this is how we got here. So as they write this story down, and again, as they go back, and the first readers of the book of Joshua, as they read about the seven the Jebusites, the Gezerites, the Hittites, they don't exist anymore. The first readers, they don't even exist, those nations. They're not even there to destroy. So the first time, these stories were kind of in their history, but as they're writing this down for this group of people, they know these people don't exist anymore. But they're reminding them of their history. This is who you are. This is what we were called to do and who we were called to be, and we failed in that. And so this is a history calling them back. Now that you're back from exile, now that we're starting again, please, please remember, choose today who you will follow. Choose today. This is a reminder for them, right? And it's all the way through. It's all the way through. Because separation is so important. Again, back to Exodus 34. Obey what I command you today. I will drive out before you Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you are going, or they will be a snare among you. Again, God assumes they're going to be around. But here's what he says. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down the Asherah poles. Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land. For when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to them, they will invite you, and you will eat their sacrifices. And when you choose some of their daughters as wives for your sons, those daughters prostitute themselves to their gods, they will lead your sons to do the same. Do not make any idols. This is the key. This is In the same passage that calls for them to go in and destroy everything, he says, here's the real thing. I want you to destroy their idols. I want you to destroy everything of worship which is not of God. And then God will run them out before you. He will drive them out. And again, don't marry, don't make covenants, don't do these things. God's assuming they're all still there. It's written as if the people are there. And so what happens then with the language of destroy everything, kill everything? What do we do with that? Well, we can still talk about those things and we can write all sorts of books. But like all the purpose behind it. It helps us reframe it. God's not just some genocidal maniac who's like, go in there and just murder everybody because it makes me feel good. Again, I tend to lean towards those who say this language is just how people taught. It's how they wrote. It's how they understood things. And so this language of we destroyed and go and destroy everything, to their understanding. And again, I believe it is their understanding because as you'll see if you read Ezra, right? Ezra's post-exilic. They go, hey, we came back to the law after the exile and we read it again. And you know what they did? They didn't kill anybody, but they did divorce all their foreign wives. When they read Deuteronomy, when they read this stuff, when they read Joshua, they understood it and said, oh, you know what we have to do? We have to get rid of this stuff. When Josiah in 2 Kings, when he reads the law, they remember that story? They discover the law and everybody's like, whoa, we haven't read this in forever. And they tear their clothes, they have a big party. And they read it to everybody. They read Deuteronomy, they read Exodus where it says go and kill everybody. They don't turn around and kill everybody. What do? They go and break all their altars. They knock down all the Asherah poles. They get rid of all of their idols. They do all of these things. Why? Because that's how they read it. That's how even though there is this language of violence, there's this language of destroying everything. The actual reality is when people read these words, they understood it. No, we got to get rid of everything that takes away from our worship of God. Anything that will lead us astray. Any of these things. And it's interesting too, again, just side note. When Israel comes into Canaan, they don't do all the things they said we're going to take these cities. They actually end up just living in the middle because they actually don't take that much land. Eventually, by David, they get it all. But they do become such a pest, and here's why I agree with the guy who says it's a continuation of the story of Exodus. It's because who runs Canaan? It's Egypt. Egypt's in control. Why? Because Egypt is the superpower. Now, as they're reading the story of Joshua, they're under the power of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, these mega empires, but they're going back to a story of empire, which is the Egyptians. And it's reminding them, we were once under empire, we're under empire again, but God defeated them, God will defeat them again. And when they went into Canaan, again, they didn't actually do all the things that they wrote they were going to do, but they did annoy Egypt enough that in 1209, the Pharaoh actually came and he fought everybody. He had to fight them off because they kept, in Joshua it says we destroyed 31 of these little cities. There's these little, again, think cities, very small. They all have their own little king, little tiny armies. They destroyed 31 of them, Joshua says. Well, the Pharaoh actually got so annoyed, he shows up and he destroys Israel. And in his writing, this is the first time we hear of Israel outside of the Bible. Right? This is in Egyptian records. And it says, we destroyed Israel, not a nation, but the people. We wiped them out, his seed is no more. Which is clearly not true. But this is where we see them. This is a group of people who do show up in Canaan, who do begin to cause problems, who do begin to overthrow these little city-states which are run by the Egyptians, which holds control in this area. And so, yes, I do believe this is a continuation of the Exodus because they're still under the control of Egypt in Canaan. And God is slowly throwing off the yoke of Egypt, and eventually he does. And under David, the golden boy, not so much in what he does, but in history of the kingdom of Israel, he finally eliminates all of it, and they become their own nation. And so this whole story leading up to David, even all the way up to David, is still, right? It's still this moment of like, who are we becoming? We're finally becoming the people who we want to be. Even the story of Jericho, right? Everybody knows that story. Walk around the town, walls fall down. How big do you think Jericho was? As a child, based on this story, how big? 7 acres. It's 7 acres. By their best estimates, there was about 100 soldiers in a place this big. That would be about how many they had. And in fact, from the records, Jericho, the big city, had collapsed long before Israel got there. But they had rebuilt a smaller city. So even the story of Jericho, and I still only pick on Jericho because it's the one where they said, we destroyed everybody except for Rahab, who survived. Right? So everybody except for her and her whole family and some extended relatives, the ones she likes at least. Right? And so even that story, which in our heads at Sunday school, massive story, huge city, massive miracle. Turns out it's a small little city-state held by Egyptian power. But for them, it was the first moment of, this is us taken out. So did they kill everybody? Clearly not. As we read later on, there were still people alive, especially Rahab. And really quick, another way that we understand this as the writers trying to help Israel remember who they are. There's these 4 stories, starting with Moses, about these giants, the people who come from the Nephilim, who were these, like, the sons of God. Kids are in here, had their way with women of men. And then they had these giants who became rulers. And they were, like, not good, and they brought evil. There's 4 different stories through the conquest where they take out giants and or the remainder descendant of giants. Who cares? Like, that's a weird story to talk about. What is the point? It's the writers reminding them, not only did we throw off Egypt, but these kind of spiritual, semi-divine evil beings who held power, God also took care of them. And so it's just a part of a bigger story, reminding everybody, now that you're back from exile, look what God has done. God will do this again. God will do this again. They will absolutely do this again. God is in control. He brought you out of Egypt. He slowly but surely took control of Canaan. And eventually and now you've lost it all. And the big key is, why did you lose it? That is the key. The key is, why did you lose it? And the answer is, we didn't choose today who we were going to follow. We actually went with this guy, and then we went with my girlfriend's God, and then her sister's God, and then a couple other gods made their way in. And again, total side note, I always feel bad and I blame Israel. Most of these people are literate. Most of them live out in the country. Most of them, when the crops go bad, one of their neighbors is like, I've got a little crop god. If you pray to him, they're like, sweet, whatever helps me. Like, these are not, I shouldn't call them bright. These are not well-educated people. These are not people living in cities. These are people living outside. Why do they keep falling into idolatry? Why do they keep? Because these are like weird country bumpkins, right? It's the best way to call them. Who are desperate. Can't have kids, you got to pray to the fertility god. Crops not doing, you got to pray to this god. You need some rain, you got to pray to the sky god. All of these, this is why they keep doing it. And over and over and over, God keeps going, will you put your trust in me? Will you worship me? Will you do this? And so this is the context for it. Again, the first people to read the book of Joshua, coming out of exile, coming back to a land that is not what it used to be. And their goal is not to be like, you were supposed to kill everybody, you didn't do it. It's no, you were supposed to separate yourselves, and you didn't do it. And so, you want to read it as hyperbole? We can do that. You want to kind of spiritualize it? We can do that. All of these things are true. And maybe God really did say, I want you to kill everybody. And we can sit with that, and we can take problems with that. We can have, or maybe they thought, God, of course God wants us to kill everybody. And they wrote that, you read the books and you pick it up. But here's what we do know. The context in which they're reading it, the context in which they're writing it, is that they really, 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 really don't want to mess up again. They really, 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 really want them to choose to follow Yahweh, to follow the Torah. And so hyperbole, straight truth, whatever it happens to be. That is not, and again, the reality is they didn't kill everybody. Hopefully that makes you feel better. Whatever they say, whatever they thought God wanted them to do, whatever God told them to do, the reality is it was very slow. God did the driving out. Yes, they probably fought actual armies, but again, small armies, they're not some massive group of people either. There's a whole history of Israel, which is interesting as you read. Remember I said there was no answer to it? There's no answer to it. But there's some context to it. There's a picture to it of the continuation of the exile and throwing off Egypt and allowing God to do this work. But they had to be faithful. And where does this get picked up, right? Where does it get picked up? This picks up in the New Testament, right? It picks up in the New Testament. What does Paul say over and over? Right? Our struggle is not against people. It's against what? Other powers. It's against, right, rulers, authorities. It's a sin, right? And they get rid of, they still use armor, they still use battle, but it's never against people. Never against people. Right? The weapons of warfare are not of the flesh. We destroy arguments and every lofty thing raised against the knowledge of God. Right? Strongholds are not actual cities, right? But they're ideas that lead us away from God. The book of Revelation, it seems very violent, but it's actually not. Everybody gathers for war, and actually God just does what God does. And he shows up as a lion, but then when you turn around, he's actually the slain lamb. There's actually no violence in it because God takes care of everything. We don't fight anybody. I don't know if you know that. There's a lot of blood, don't get me wrong. But we don't actually fight anybody. And over, especially in the book of Revelation, how do we conquer? Who is it that gets lifted up? It's those who are faithful. It's those who give their lives. The martyrs, not those who take lives. And the call all through the New Testament and the Old Testament is what? It's faithfulness. It's faithfulness to God, not violence against other people. And so we get to wrestle with the Old Testament passages. Again, I encourage you to read it. And if you're like, I just need to reject it because it's how I got to do it, we can work with that. I can read it through the lens of Jesus. We can do that hyperbole. We can do that. It's just straight facts. God just wanted everybody gone to clear the land for his own people. You can do that. You got to work with those things. You got to sit with those things. But what do we do with it? Because we live not in the light of conquest, and we live in light of Jesus, right? We live in light of Jesus. And the early church, they accepted these passages. They accepted them. No one said, that was totally wrong, and obviously God didn't want that. But no one actually says, hey, that was great, I'm glad they did that. No, what do? They say, hey, we read them, we understand them. And here's an interesting side fact for you. In Hebrews, in the Hall of Fame of people who are faithful, Joshua doesn't make it, but Rahab does. Rahab's in there. That's a weird little make you think when 2 a.m. tonight when you're up. They don't denounce the passages in the New Testament, but they also don't focus on them, do they? What do they focus on? What do they focus on? Real quick, what do they focus on? Tell your neighbor. What's the focus of the New Testament? No one's talking. Good. What? It's Jesus. Right? It's Jesus. They don't debate the violence of the Old Testament, but they do keep coming back to Jesus, and they say, with Jesus is the clearest picture we have. If the cross, which does away with violence, and Jesus, who taught the whole time, blessed are the what? The super violent who wipe out their enemies? No. He says, pray for your enemies. Do good for your enemies. If you can't love your enemies, then how are you supposed to love God? If you love people who love you back, easy. But how do you love people who are your enemies? That's what they focus on. So they have the Old Testament, they understand it, and they still understand that we are called to something greater. So no matter how you sit with the Old Testament, I encourage you, read some of these things. There's all sorts of good articles out there and books. I encourage you to have these debates and discussions. But as we move forward in light of this, and again, when people talk to you, just tell them it's a continuation of Exodus and explain the whole history of it and where Israel comes from, and tell them to read 4 books. And no, talk about it. Say, you know what? I actually don't fully understand this. It actually bothers me. Here's a couple ideas we can talk about. But then we always bring it back to Jesus. We bring it back. Because what are we going to come and celebrate in 2 minutes? What are we celebrating? Right? Not the victorious guy with the sword and cutting throats and blood up to horses' bridles. That's not what we're celebrating. What are we celebrating? We're celebrating the Lamb who laid down his life. That's what we celebrate. We're celebrating the Lamb who said, hey, pray for your enemies, do good to those who persecute you. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the peacemakers. This is who Jesus is. This is the New Testament church. How did the church grow? Because as they were killing them, they're like, what's wrong with these people? They just keep being peaceful, and they keep loving us back, and eventually that turned the tide. Because people went, what a bunch of weirdos. They keep doing good. How come they're not violent? And then people went, wait, why aren't they violent? Who is this Jesus? And the rest is history. So as we gather today, right? Maybe we spiritualize it, like the Orthodox. We read things about violence and go, I don't understand it, but where's the violence in my own life? Where's the sin that I need to fight against? Where's the idolatry? What am I fighting against? We're never going to truly know how they meant it, what they meant. We don't truly know how they read that in the first thing, but we do know is the teachings of Jesus. We do know that he conquers violence. We do know that there was no violence in the first creation and there's no violence in the new creation. These are all things we know. And so this is what we celebrate. And when we come to celebrate right now, what are we doing? We're taking the bread of the Son of God who laid down his life. We didn't take anybody's life, but laid down his own life. And so, yes, it's a difficult thing to talk about, and there's all sorts of different answers. I was not helpful at all to anybody. If you wanted a good answer. But where we end up is always Jesus. Not that we dismiss it, not that we cover over it, but what we are called to. What we are tasked with, the joy that we are given is being a part of this movement, this community of Jesus people who follow his lead. So as we take the bread and the cup, we say, thank you that we don't have to go out and kill our enemies. I don't want to do that. Thank you that we get to be a part of a community who gets to go out and lay down our lives in love for those around us, which is probably a lot harder, by the way. As you take the bread and the cup, still struggle with the violence in the Old Testament, absolutely. But always end up at the cross, always end up in Christ. Always look forward to that new creation. And if people really struggle with Old Testament violence, show them the first creation, show them the new creation. This is the ideal. This is what God intended. Everything in between is not what he intended. And what is our role as a church, as Christians in that? How do we bring that heaven to earth here and now? How do we fight against these things? So we celebrate the end of violence in the cross. Jesus took violence upon himself and then preached his peace. We celebrate that. But also as you take the bread and cup, ask yourself, where is my role? Where is my place in this? Moving forward, being a part of this community of the blessed peacemakers and the blessed meek, those who are willing to pray for and love our enemies. How are we going to do that? We're going to close in prayer and then we'll pass around the things.